They wanted to create a plane that would change warfare, but instead, they got a machine that became a symbol of hopelessness. The project, born out of ambition and desperation, promised to be the bane of American bombers, but turned into a trophy carried across the ocean. Its story has it all: risky experiments, takeoff accidents, vibrations that threatened to tear the fuselage apart in midair, and plans for hundreds of machines, all dashed by a single event. It's the story of an engineer who defied tradition and a country that became a prisoner of its own mistakes. You'll hear about secret German technologies, a jet-powered version that remained on paper, and why even experienced pilots feared taking the controls of this aircraft. The end of this story is no less dramatic than the war itself, and it's what makes the Shinden a legend that cannot be forgotten. Japan, in the first half of the 20th century, was a nation confident in its exceptionalism and strength. The government built its state ideology on the doctrine of offense and superiority, where the main goal was not to hold territory, but to expand it. The Navy and Army received colossal resources to create technology capable of attacking and destroying the enemy on their approaches. Air forces followed the same logic. Designers and engineers created planes that were meant to break through defenses, strike, and return victorious. In this vision of the future, defense seemed secondary, lacking any heroic aura. The problem was that the world was rapidly changing. The United States and the Soviet Union were developing their own aviation, betting not only on offense but also on defending their skies. When the first bombs began to fall on Japanese cities, it became apparent that the entire might of the military machine was incapable of withstanding massive raids. A nation that built its greatness on the idea of invincibility suddenly faced a reality where it had no tool to stop enemy bombers. The reason was simple. Japan lacked the foundation for creating effective interceptors. All forces and resources were poured into developing offensive aircraft. Even when it became clear that the situation demanded change, retooling industry and the engineering school proved too difficult. There was neither time, nor experience, nor trained specialists. Attempts were made to rectify the situation, but each was too late. Aircraft that could have defended the skies remained on blueprints or appeared too late, when the war's outcome was already decided. Thus, a paradox emerged. A nation striving for world domination couldn't defend its own cities. Japan, before and after World War II, are two entirely different states. The former was ruled by ideas of expansion and confidence in its uniqueness. The latter saw the rise of an awareness of vulnerability and the need to rethink its future. At this turning point, a project emerged that was meant to become a symbol of a bold attempt to change the tide in the skies, the interceptor with the unusual name Shinden. By early 1943, the air war in the Pacific had reached a new level. American bombers easily penetrated Japanese cities, and the old fighters, once symbols of strength, began to rapidly lose effectiveness. Their speed, climb rate, and armament no longer met the demands of real combat. The Japanese command faced a situation for the first time where its usual trump cards no longer worked, and the nation was threatened by devastating raids against which there was no reliable defense. Under mounting pressure, the Imperial Navy urgently issued a new specification demanding the creation of a modern interceptor. This document was a cry for help, an attempt to quickly turn the tide in the air. It outlined specific parameters that would enable the aircraft to counter the enemy's newest planes, high speed, rapid climb to altitude, and powerful armament. The atmosphere in the country was a mix of despair and hope. On one hand, it was clear that time was catastrophically short and resources were dwindling. On the other, engineers believed that a bold technical solution could shift the balance of power. At this moment, several projects emerged, each vying to be the countermeasure against American raids. Among them was the most unusual, standing out with its daring appearance and unconventional design approach. The machine destined to become a symbol of Japan's attempt to reach for the future was named Shinden. A key figure in the creation of the Shinden was a man who, at first glance, didn't fit the typical image of a wartime Japanese engineer. Mitsunori Tsuruno was a naval officer, but also possessed a bold technical imagination that wasn't confined by orders and instructions. His ideas seemed too daring even for colleagues accustomed to risk and experimentation. He He dreamed not just of a new machine, but of the interceptor of tomorrow, a plane that would be ahead of its time and change the rules of aerial combat. Tsuruno realized that traditional design approaches no longer worked. The Japanese aircraft industry relied on proven solutions: maneuverability through lightweight construction, emphasis on close combat and dive attacks. But with American bombers flying higher, faster, and protected by dense formations and machine guns, these principles became useless. A different approach was needed, one that could turn a Japanese fighter into a machine specifically designed to intercept heavy targets. It was then that he proposed a revolutionary canard configuration. This idea involved installing small horizontal stabilizers at the nose and a pusher propeller engine at the rear. For most engineers of that era, such a configuration seemed too risky, but Tsuruno believed it would provide better control, stability at high speeds, and the ability to place powerful armament in the front. Tsuruno's vision was driven not only by technical standards, but also by the very mindset of Japanese designers. He seemed to be breaking through dogmas, arguing that only radical solutions could save the country. He couldn't bring the project to life alone, but his persistence and belief in his idea made the command listen. Thus, the concept that would later become the Shinden was born, a plane that embodied the courage of one man and the hope of a nation. When the project received the designation J7Ws, it immediately stood out from other developments. Everything about it was unusual, from its daring shape to its configuration, which was rarely used in Japan. The canard design with front horizontal stabilizers and a tail-mounted engine sparked debate, but it was precisely this that Tsuruno saw as the key to success. In such a design, the pilot was positioned as close as possible to the armament mounted in the nose, and the pusher propeller at the rear freed up space for powerful guns. Engineers viewed this move as a true challenge to tradition. In classic Japanese fighters, lightness and sharp maneuverability were paramount, but they always had a weakness: fragile construction and insufficient armament. The Shinden promised to change these rules. The canard design was intended to reduce the risk of spins, ensure better stability at high speeds, and simplify the overall structure, making it more predictable in combat. The atmosphere around the project was a mix of inspiration and anxiety. Every step was an experiment, every calculation a leap into the unknown. In the workshops and on the drawing boards, a plane was born that seemed out of its time. Some specialists saw it as a chance to save Japan's skies. Others considered it a dangerously risky venture. But it was this adventurousness that gave the project its special charm. The Shinden became a symbol of hope for a technological breakthrough, proof that even under catastrophic pressure, a solution could be found to turn the tide of war. The heart of any combat aircraft is its engine, and it was here that the Shinden project faced its biggest dilemma. Tsuruno's original design called for a turbojet engine that could elevate Japan to a new level of aerial warfare. A jet engine promised speed, high-altitude performance, and a significant technological leap. But for Japanese industry at the time, this proved unattainable. Work on jet engines was underway, but they remained blueprints and experimental models lacking sufficient thrust and reliability. A compromise had to be found, and it was the Mitsubishi MKC-9D radial engine with 18 cylinders and a supercharger. It was installed in the rear fuselage, and its power was transmitted to a 6-bladed variable pitch propeller. This solution seemed bold, but it no longer aligned with global trends. Piston engine aviation was rapidly giving way to jet power. Thus, the Shinden found itself positioned between two eras. Its design was intended for a quick transition to turbojet propulsion, as if the engineers had left room for future upgrades, but reality forced them to settle for an older type of engine. This was the duality of the project. Outwardly, it symbolized a breakthrough. Inwardly, it remained a hostage to past technologies. In early 1943, the Imperial Navy formulated new requirements for fighters, designated 18 Shi. These focused on 3 areas: an air superiority fighter, a night fighter, and a defensive interceptor. It was this last category that proved crucial, as it was intended to stop the American bombers increasingly appearing over Japan. The specification for the interceptor was extremely stringent. The aircraft had to achieve a speed of at least 665 km/h, climb to 8 km in 9 minutes, and be armed with at least two 30mm cannons. For Japan's war-strained industry, these parameters seemed almost unattainable, but there was no other choice. The country needed an aircraft that could withstand the assault. Several projects entered the competition. The single-engine J6K1 GINP seemed like a simple solution, but its performance clearly fell short of the mark. The twin-engine J5N1 Tenru promised more power but proved too heavy and difficult to handle. Against this backdrop, the Shinden, proposed by Captain Susuruno, appeared the most promising. Its aerodynamic design, unusual configuration, and inherent capabilities offered a chance not just to meet, but to exceed the requirements. The Navy closely monitored the results of initial calculations and model tests, and although doubts persisted around the project, it was the Shinden that proved to be the most viable option. The other competitors gradually dropped out, making way for the aircraft that was destined to become the symbol of the Japanese Air Force's last hope. When the Navy decided to give the green light to the Shinden project, the question arose: who would undertake its realization? Major manufacturers were already overwhelmed with orders and simply didn't have the resources for another risky aircraft. The choice fell to the Kyushu Hikoki Kogyo Company, which had never built high-performance aircraft before. For many, this decision seems strange, entrusting the fate of a defensive interceptor to a company without experience in creating complex machinery. But the Navy had no other options. Time was too short, and no other factories were available. To compensate for the lack of experience, a team of engineers from the Dai-ichi Kaigun Koku Gijutsusho was brought in, and Tsuruno himself headed the project, transforming from the initiator of the idea to its main supervisor. He not only oversaw technical calculations, but also personally participated in production meetings, striving to inspire the team to work on a machine that was meant to save the country. However, the initial difficulties surfaced almost immediately. The factory lacked experience in assembling complex components. Parts had to be modified on site, and designers constantly made changes, adapting the project to actual production conditions. Every decision led to delays and the risk of missing deadlines. Workers and engineers lived in an atmosphere of constant tension, understanding. The entire Navy is watching them, and the future of Japan's skies depends on their success. It was in these conditions that the Shinden was born, not in the hands of giant corporations, but within the walls of a factory that was learning alongside the machine, paving its way into the unknown step by step. As the first outlines of the Shinden began to take shape in metal, it became clear that this aircraft was unlike any conventional Japanese fighter. Its silhouette seemed alien, as if it had arrived from the future. The cockpit was located in the middle of the fuselage, offering forward and downward visibility, a rarity for aircraft of that era. In front of the cockpit was a small horizontal stabilizer, giving the plane a distinctive canard look. This placement was immediately noticeable and surprised even experienced engineers. The wing had a swept-back shape with ailerons located closer to the midpoint of its span. It gave the aircraft a sleek profile and a silhouette unfamiliar to the Japanese school of aeronautics, which preferred simpler and lighter solutions. A massive six-bladed propeller was housed in the tail section, connected to a powerful radial engine. This arrangement not only altered the aircraft's balance, but also necessitated a rethinking of its control logic. The pilot felt pushes from behind, as if an invisible force were propelling him. Large air intakes were made in the fuselage sides to cool the engine. They resembled the gills of a predatory fish, giving the aircraft an even more aggressive appearance. Even the landing gear struts differed from the norm. The tricycle gear with a nose wheel made the machine visually heavy but stable on the ground. Compared to traditional Japanese aircraft, the impression of the Shinden was stunning. Those were built around lightness and smooth lines, while the new interceptor looked like a steel dragon, sharp, angular, and severe. It seemed out of its time, and it was this sense of alien design that made one wonder if it could live up to the hopes placed upon it, or if it would remain merely a beautiful but unmanageable fantasy. The Shinden's main argument in aerial combat was to be its armament. Designers planned for 4 powerful Type 5 cannons mounted in the nose. Each gun had a high rate of fire and enormous muzzle velocity. Together, they could unleash a volley comparable to a short artillery barrage. Just 8 seconds of continuous fire turned the aircraft's forward hemisphere into a deadly stream capable of breaking through even heavy bomber formations. But this power had a downside: limited ammunition, only a few dozen shells per barrel. This meant the pilot had to aim with utmost precision. A single salvo could decide the outcome of a skirmish, but there was often no second chance. To aid aiming, 2 7.92mm machine guns were added. Their role was not to inflict damage, but for ranging. Short bursts allowed the pilot to determine the trajectory and conserve precious main armament shells. Despite the limited ammunition, the project was conceived as a weapon of desperation against American flying fortresses. Those carried defensive turrets, but the Shinden was supposed to approach from the front and literally burn a hole in their formation. At this moment, the cannons turned the fighter into a true predator, whose fangs were not tusks but streams of fire and metal. It was through this salvo that it was meant to become the terror of bombers, even if the flight was short and risky. By early 1945, the Shinden had finally moved beyond blueprints and mock-ups. Aerodynamic tests were conducted on specially prepared models, revealing that the unusual canard configuration indeed offered several advantages. The military saw this as a signal to accelerate work. The prototype needed to fly as soon as possible. Assembly proceeded under constant rush, with every part checked on the fly. When the fuselage of the first aircraft was ready, the project's initiator, Captain Tsuruno, was cleared for testing. In July, he sat in the cockpit to take his creation into the air for the first time. But reality proved far harsher than calculations. During acceleration, the powerful propeller generated strong torque, and the aircraft unexpectedly veered off the runway. The machine was thrown aside, propeller blades bent, and the wing was damaged. The first takeoff ended in an accident before the wheels even left the ground. Problems weren't limited to this. The engine cooling system proved insufficiently effective. Oil overheated faster than engineers expected. Testing had to be postponed, and the aircraft was sent for repairs. To improve safety, small additional wheels were installed on the vertical stabilizers, meant to cushion potential impacts during runway departures. Each new component revealed hidden risks. The Shinden was a machine that tested the limits of what was possible, and therefore, every step forward was accompanied by unexpected difficulties. Its behavior remained unpredictable, and even experienced engineers couldn't say in advance how the next attempt to get this daring design airborne would end. On August 3, 1945, the Shinden finally lifted off the ground. Test pilot Miyase took the controls for the first true flight. The aircraft was fueled with only 38 liters of fuel and 810 liters of oil. This was enough for just a few minutes in the air, but the engineers dared not provide more, fearing a sudden accident. The Shinden taxied down the runway and, as if overcoming invisible resistance, rose into the sky. The pilot kept the aircraft low, no higher than 400 meters. The speed did not exceed 300 km/h. From the outside, it looked like a long-awaited victory. The plane flew, responded to controls, and even executed a confident landing. But inside the cockpit, Miyase encountered problems that immediately indicated the new interceptor's difficult nature. The main enemy was the torque from the powerful propeller. The aircraft constantly pulled to the right, forcing the pilot to continuously correct its course. Landing was also challenging. The fuselage was tilted so much that forward visibility was almost nil, and the propeller constantly tried to steer the plane sideways. Added to this were the overheating oil, noticeable fuselage vibrations, and a clear tendency for the nose to dip. The first flight was dual-natured. On one hand, the machine proved it could take to the sky and return to Earth. On the other, every minute of flight revealed new weaknesses, making it obvious that the path to a reliable interceptor would be long and painful. The Shinden showed itself to be a living and dangerous creature that required taming before it could be called a weapon. Subsequent Shinden flights were meant to confirm its viability, but each new experience brought more anxiety than confidence. The machine repeatedly took to the air, and with each flight, new design weaknesses emerged. Strong fuselage vibrations hindered the pilot's ability to aim, but the aircraft persistently pulled downwards, and the engine oil overheated faster than deemed acceptable. All these signs indicated that the project required extensive refinement, and the country had no more time. Engineers tried to fix problems on the fly, strengthened components, adjusted balance, and experimented with cooling systems. But each modification took weeks that Japan no longer had. The situation resembled running in a closed circle. As soon as one malfunction was resolved, another immediately appeared. Even if the Shinden could have been brought to an acceptable state, the main question remained: who could pilot it? The machine demanded high training, and experienced aviators were catastrophically scarce by then. Young pilots would struggle to handle such capricious technology, negating the purpose of mass production. A similar drama unfolded in Germany, where by the end of the war, jet fighters were hastily introduced into service. They were fast but too complex for mass deployment, and in the hands of inexperienced pilots, they became more of a risk than a weapon. Japan found itself in the same trap. The Shinden was born as a response to American bombings, but with each passing day, it became clear that it was more a symbol of ambition than a practical tool for war. Time was slipping away, and with it, the last hope of turning this project into a full-fledged force vanished. When the initial tests showed that the Shinden was capable of flight, the Navy was eager to plan for mass production. The Kyushu plant was to produce about 30 such aircraft monthly, and Nakajima was preparing to assemble hundreds of interceptors. Military staffs drew diagrams where the new weapon would cover Japanese skies against American bombers. The aircraft, which had recently existed only in Tsuruno's imagination, was becoming part of large strategic calculations. But these plans remained on paper. While engineers were fixing malfunctions and pilots were learning to handle the unfamiliar machine, time continued to pass. In the summer of 1945, events unfolded rapidly. American raids intensified, and with them came the war's finale. Production hadn't even truly begun. Lines remained empty, machines stood idle, workers waited for parts that never arrived. The Shinden seemed to freeze at the boundary between concept and reality. Everything that was supposed to be the start of mass production instantly lost its meaning. The end of the war nullified the project, giving it no chance to prove itself in combat. The aircraft, on which hopes were placed to defend the skies, remained merely an experiment whose fate was decided before it could truly announce itself. It all ended before it even began. While the first Shinden was attempting to prove its worth in the sky, engineers were already working on the next stage, the J7W version. It was intended to feature a turbojet engine, finally transforming it into the future machine Tsuruno had dreamed of. On paper, it looked daring: a redesigned structure, modified components, and entirely different flight dynamics. The German BMW 003A engine was considered as a basis, which Japan had obtained in the form of technical documentation. The Germans were on the same path and had already tested similar installations, and Japanese engineers hoped to replicate their success. But the J7W remained a shadow. Its airframe was built, but it never took to the air. Paper projects and calculations did not translate into metal with real thrust. The jet engine could not be brought to an operational state. Thrust was insufficient, lifespan negligible, and time was running out. The war ended before the prototype had a chance to come to life. The fate of the J7W became a symbol of an unfulfilled future. It could have been Japan's first jet-powered fighter. It could have changed perceptions of the country's aviation capabilities, but it remained only a promise. It was the silhouette of a plane that was always within reach but never spread its wings. It embodied ambition, borrowed ideas, and an unattainable dream, something that never happened. When the passions of war subsided, the Shinden remained not a weapon, but a monument to its own contradictions. On paper, its characteristics were impressive. A wingspan of over 11 meters, a length of almost 10 meters, a maximum speed of around 750 km/h, a service ceiling of 12 km, and a range of up to 850 km. It could carry 4 30mm cannons and small bombs, making it a formidable opponent for any bomber. But behind this potential lay the problems that became its downfall. The aircraft proved difficult to control, requiring an experienced pilot, of whom there were almost none left by the end of the war. The engine overheated, vibrations hindered aiming, and the tendency for the nose to dip made landing a dangerous ordeal. Even if series production had been established, every sortie would have been a risk, and the Army would hardly have received a mass defensive tool. The Shinden became a symbol of Japan's unfulfilled ambitions. It embodied the drive to catch up and surpass the enemy, the courage of the designer, and the willingness to take risks for victory. But the war ended before the engineers could complete their experiment. Of the aircraft prophesied to be the terror of American bombers, only one surviving example remains. It was taken to the United States and placed in Park Ridge as a trophy and an object of study. Today, it stands not as a weapon, but as a testament to an era. Its lines speak of courage and desperation, its story of hope that never became reality. The Shinden outlived its wartime country and remains a silent reminder of how close Japan came to the future and how quickly it lost it. The Shinden did not become a mass-produced fighter, but its story outlived the war. It wasn't a simple prototype hastily assembled. It reflected the hopes and miscalculations of an entire nation. This aircraft became a symbol of Japan, which lived with a dream of the future, but became a prisoner of its own illusions and strategic errors. Its lines conveyed the audacity of engineers ready to break traditions, and its fate, the tragedy of a time when even the boldest ideas were drowned in delays and lack of resources. Pre-war Japan was confident in its superiority, built a doctrine of offense, and believed its technology could crush any enemy. Post-war, the country was entirely different. Weakened, forced to abandon militaristic ambitions, and to see the world through different eyes. The Shinden remained on the border between these two worlds. It was born out of military ideology, but its fate showed the powerlessness of old approaches in the face of new realities. It can be called a symbol of defeat because it never became the weapon for which it was created. But it can also be called a symbol of audacity because it showed that even in the final, darkest months of the war, there was room for a dream of breakthrough. The Shinden became a monument to a transitional era when the future was already knocking at the door, but the past still held the country in its chains. And it is this that makes its story so captivating and bitter at the same time.